Hello and welcome to Nature Knowledge. This is a speaker series with experts sharing scientific knowledge on current issues affecting nature in Florida. I'm your host, Dr. Shelly Johnson, State Specialized Agent in Natural Resources with University of Florida IFAS Extension. Thanks for joining us today.
So today, for our topic for today, I'm really pleased to present this topic. If you know me, you know that one of my favorite animals and natural resource issues to talk about and learn about and study are bats. And I've spent many years studying bats in numerous parts of the country and even other parts of the world. So this presentation today is going to focus mostly on bat exclusions, bat houses, and some updates on the recent exclusion that was conducted at the UF Bat House on campus. And just so you know, last October, I presented a nature knowledge program on bats that kind of answered a lot of basic information, kind of went over the frequently asked questions, responded to myths and misconceptions that people have. So this program today is, I'm going to touch on a few of those things because it's hard for me not to at least mention some of the basics to get us started here. But if you want to find that program, you can go back to that website that I just showed you, and you'll be able to review that, and encourage you to do that. Especially, as October moves through, everyone always has bat questions. So maybe a lot of you are also educators or natural resource professionals that interact with the public. So it's a good time to review your bat knowledge so that you're up to date with answering people's questions. So a little about me. I'm the State Specialized Agent in Natural Resources with UF IFAS Extension, and I'm an affiliate faculty in the Department of Wildlife, Ecology, and Conservation. And as I mentioned earlier, I have had many years of playing with bats. I say that in meaning I've been working with them, but it's always a pleasure. So done a lot of bat research out west in Arizona and Wyoming in particular. I did a lot of long-term monitoring projects there, and also worked with bats in rehabilitation. And it's something that I always like talking about. So if you ever have bat questions, please let me know. I'm always happy to share. So the presentation today is going to discuss some of the considerations and the challenges of moving bats from a building. Again, I'm going to cover a little bit about some bat basics, and then I'm going to talk mostly about exclusions, the UF Bat House, and a little bit at the end, because this is such a common question about how you can build your own bat house. And so I'm hoping this information today will help you with your own, if you have bat issues, but also that you can help educate others about the proper way to handle bats if someone's having a conflict with them. So a quick review of some bat basics. So I just need to touch on these things because they're just the coolest things about bats, and I like everyone to remember how cool bats are. We have at this time over 1,400 species recognized across the globe. They're the only mammal capable of true flight. There's some species that can easily fly 30 miles per hour of sustained flight. Some have been recorded much faster. So that's a very cool thing about them. They're very long-lived for being such a small animal, and also with very few offspring each year for being such a small animal. That's not generally what we see in nature. And there's typically only one pup per year for each female. So they're not having like a large litters of animals every year. They also have a really high metabolism for being such a long-lived animal, and so they do go into torpor if they get cold, and they also hibernate, which a lot of you are probably aware of. Also, one of the really unique cool things about bats is that they use sonar to echolocate. Obviously, there's a few other animals that we also know use echolocation, but there's really not very many of them, so it's a very cool thing. Also, just to correct some of the myths, these are always things that come up, that somehow we can't seem to permanently dispel. So we will just make sure that you know that bats are not blind. They can see perfectly well. They can see just as well as you and I, even though they have the amazing capacity to use echolocation. Bats are not flying mice. They are actually more closely related to carnivores. We're actually closer related to mice than bats are. So also, they do not get stuck in your hair. Bats are actually very, very good flyers. They do not want to get stuck in your hair. They can easily fly around you. That's a myth. I don't know where that ever started, but also bats do not suck your blood. That's definitely a myth. Of the many species that we have in the world, there are 3 that are primarily blood feeders. Humans are definitely not their prey. They generally feed on things like farm animals. So that's really not a concern, and they're certainly not in North America at this point. And also, bats can carry diseases, including rabies, but it is actually a very, very small percentage of them. We think probably about less than 0.5%. So although we should always be careful with handling wild animals, it's really not a super big concern as far as possibility. Okay, and I also can't do a bat presentation without talking at least for one slide about the benefits of bats. And most bats, I mean, all bats are really beneficial in whatever ecosystem that they're in. And most bats in North America are insectivores, so they're preying on nocturnal arthropods, moths, beetles, mosquitoes, midges, and they're the only major predator of these night-flying insects. So one little tiny insectivorous bat can eat up to 1,000 mosquito-sized insects in an hour, which is a tremendous amount. So they really are impacting these nighttime flying populations, which are often things that we want to control. These are often agricultural pests. These are often forest pests. So having bats around helps us lower the use of pesticides, and the benefits of not having as many pesticides, including saving industry billions of dollars per year in both loss of crops and reduced need for chemicals. So there's all around many good reasons to support bats being in the habitat. So here in Florida, a few basics for our bats here. We have 13 species that live here year round. And that does include 2 of our resident species, which are listed as federally endangered. That includes the gray myotis and the Florida bonneted bat, listed under federally endangered within U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We also have probably about 7 other species, which are considered accidental or occasional visitors that come through the state. And one thing to remember is that Florida bats are, and most bats, I mean, bats in North America in general, they're relatively small. So we think of, if you live in North Central Florida, if you've ever gone to the Louis Bat Fest, which is a great thing, it's coming up soon, you can see the old world flying fruit bats, and they're huge. Those are not the bats that we have in North America as far as the native population. So bats here are, the size of your hand, make it look a W, and that's the very, very biggest bat we'd have in North America. So they're pretty small, 8 to 12 inches wingspan, 2 to 3 inches above body length, and weight. Even the largest one is, maybe the size of a chicken egg. So they're not very big. And so as far as the seasonality of bats, because of the climate that we have here in Florida, most bats do stay in the state year round. And they also will often use multiple roosts within a single year. So most important season for bats is what we call maternity season. And that's from April 15th to August 15th. So that's generally when the females are pregnant and giving birth to their young, and then raising the young, which we call pups. And so even once we get to fall and even through the winter, the most bats are still here. They may disperse. They may not be in those larger maternity colonies. They may be in smaller groups or even solitary, roosting in other locations. If it gets really cold, especially think up in North Florida, they will go into torpor if we get into low temperatures. We don't generally have any bats that are doing a true hibernation here because it's not cold enough. And then as far as thinking about the types of habitat that bats are using here in Florida, we do have some caves and some bats will use those caves, but we don't have a lot of those big caves with giant big colonies like they do up in the Northeast. So that's a part of the habitat, but not a very big one here in Florida. We do have tree roosting bats, and a lot of different components of trees are important to tree roosting bats. They'll roost in the hollow parts of a dead tree. They'll go under the bark of a snag, or when the bark starts peeling off, they'll go underneath that. They will be in the palm fronds of the dead palm fronds underneath of a palm tree. They will roost in Spanish moss, and they'll even some bats will go into like the leaves of an oak tree or a big leafy tree. And we also have bats that like to use human-made structures. And so these also tend to be some of the bats that maybe we would find roosting in caves elsewhere, but we have bats that will go into attics or sheds, under bridges. That bridge is not in Florida, but we certainly do have bridges here in Florida that bats may be roosting under, and also in a bat house if you have bat houses up around. So the other thing to make sure I want to definitely mention, because this really leads into what we're going to talk about today, is that Florida bats are protected. Even though only 2 of our 13 species are federally listed, they still have protection status. All 13 of the native species have protection status here in the state. So it is legal to kill bats in Florida. Also, you cannot use pesticides, poisons for the purpose of harming, killing, or deterring bats. And also there are requirements which must be followed to remove bats from buildings and other structures. So this leads us into kind of the big topic that I want to spend a little bit more time on today, which are bat exclusions. So it's not uncommon for people to have some bats, 1 or 2 bats, or maybe more, living in a structure or near their home. And so the question is, well, what can you do about that? And maybe they're fine, but maybe you really want them to move out. And so what's the proper way to do that in a way that won't harm the bats, that you'll also stay compliant with the regulations, and so that we can still have the bats around, hopefully being beneficial and doing all the good things that they do. So, what is an exclusion? It's a very straightforward term. It means exactly what it sounds like, but it also kind of becomes jargon because we maybe say it a lot. An exclusion is simply a process to exclude the bats from a location, typically a structure where we don't want them. So a very common question I often get, usually around the end of the summer, is people say, I have bats and how do I get rid of them? And often I think why this happens at the end of the summer is because at this point the pups are now flying. So where there's maybe a colony of female bats, now it's doubled in size because each of them have a pup and now the pups are flying. So people are noticing the bats more. Pups are also, still learning how to fly. So they might be flying in maybe a little bit more in the daylight when they shouldn't be because they just don't know yet. Flying, ending up on the ground because they're not very good flyers. So people are just seeing them more at that time of year. But this certainly could be a question that comes up at any point. So when someone first calls, the first question that I ask is, how many bats are there? Where is it? Is it just one, or is it a whole bunch of bats? And so if maybe it's outside, if it's a bat that's just outside of your house, on the side of your wall, inside of a tree, sometimes people will see them on the ground, and often they're going to be fine. As I mentioned earlier, very few bats actually have rabies. There's definitely a common thought that if you see a bat on the ground, 100% it must be sick, and that's really just not true. The case is that bats it's really hard for bats to actually take off from the ground. So if they end up on the ground just because they made a mistake and thought they could land on the ground, or maybe they got cold, which is pretty common, and they couldn't fly because they got too cold, and so they started going into torpor. A lot of times they will end up on the ground, and they really need to be up high so they can kind of have a little bit of a dropping point in order to start flying. So they don't necessarily need to be collected, but if you can somehow help them get up onto a structure, you can either leave them, they'll probably crawl over to a wall or a tree and just climb up it. You can use a long, broom or something and try and help them get to a safer spot. But then the next question is, okay, well, what if it's not just outside? Maybe it's inside of the house. And so, is it in the structure? Probably you don't want it inside your living space. That's definitely going to be a problem. So first of all, we want to make sure, do you know if the bat was in contact with anyone? It particularly was there anyone in the structure with the bat that maybe can't tell you if they were in contact? Small child that wouldn't be able to tell you like, oh, I was, that bat was on me. That would be something you'd want to make sure to definitely, in that case, the bat you'd want to contact Department of Health and just make sure that the bat is not sick, because we don't want to take illness, we have to take that seriously. But if we know that the bat just flew into the house, no one has had contact with the bat, first thing you really want to do is just open up all the doors and windows, turn on the lights so that you can see, so that the bat can see, and just wait. Most likely the bat's going to fly out. They probably don't really want to be in your house. And if they're not flying around, say they're in a corner on the ground somewhere, and again, it's very hard for them to fly off the ground. So what I generally suggest is, find a long-handled broom, maybe a trash can or a bin, and hold that broom up to them, the bristly end towards them, and they'll often just kind of climb on there. You can take that outside and you can just lean it against a tree with the bristly end up, and they're either going to hang out there, or maybe they'll climb off of it onto the tree or maybe a brick wall, and you can just leave them there. And most likely when you come back after dark, they're going to be gone. So that's generally what I would say. Again, this is if there's just one bat, he happened to end up in your house because he accidentally flew in there. Generally doesn't require a typical exclusion. They just maybe need some assistance getting outside. Now, what happens if there's actually maybe a lot of bats, a small colony? Depends on the situation. Now, if it was me personally and it was in an outside building up in the attic and it was just 4, 5, 10 bats, I personally don't know if I would worry about it right away, but some people maybe would. And certainly if you have a large colony, you're going to have to try and figure out how to get them out of that structure. Eventually, there's going to be a lot of guano accumulating, and exclusion is probably going to be necessary. So the very, very first thing before anything else happens is to think about the timing. So along with the regulations that I mentioned earlier, one of those, the third one that I mentioned, was that you have to follow the guidelines. And what the guidelines are is that you must only conduct an exclusion after maternity season. So that means it must be after August 15th and before April 15th. So that's the time when the pups, after August 15th, Most pups are going to be flying, so they'll be able to fly around, to be able to get out of the structure when you do the exclusion. And once I explain how the exclusion works, hopefully that will make sense to you. So another thing you need to do, and even if you're still within the maternity window, say it's in the beginning of August, and you can't do the exclusion yet, what you can start doing is trying to figure out where the bats are coming out of the building. So I'm just going to call this basically step one. Where are they getting into the space? So if they're up in the attic, or especially if they're getting into the living space, where are they getting in? So you can start doing this well before you even have the exclusion planned. You can start watching to see where the bats are coming and going from. So here is the answer to the question that I posed at the very beginning. Bats can fit through a space about the size of your thumb. So it's about a 1/2 inch gap, maybe a little bit more. If there's a space like that in the wall or the roof, that's enough for them to get in and out. And again, remember, these bats are not very big. So depending on the species of bat, some of them could squeeze through a space that's quite small. And so what you really want to do is, depending on, again, where the bats are, they in the attic, you're going to want to thoroughly look around the entire house. You want to look during the daylight when you can see. You want to look for any gaps that are there that are at least a 1/2 inch wide or larger. And also you can look for staining. So that picture on the right side is where bats probably have been going in and out. And they have a lot of body oils, and after many nights of numerous bats going in and out, it starts to rub off on there. And so you can kind of see that a lot of times. And then also you'll want to go out at night once you think you have an idea maybe where they're coming in and out, or have an idea where the openings are. Get a few people to help you, because you'll want to try and watch every opening that you can. And so go out just right at sunset and kind of stay out there for 30 minutes if you can, and try and see if you can see where bats are emerging out of the structure. So once you have an idea where the bats are coming in and out, the next step, and this is probably where most people go wrong, is they don't take the time to actually seal up the openings that are not being used by the bats. So now that you know which ones they are going in and out, you need to first actually seal up the ones that they're not using, because eventually when we get to a few steps down the line here, if we haven't sealed up the other openings, they're going to just start using those other openings. So this is not a short process. You really need to go through, find those openings that are there but maybe not being used, and seal those. So the other openings that they are using, they must still remain open, again, until after maternity season is over, which is August 15th, and until you do the exclusion. So the bats still need to be able to get in and out. If you get antsy and you seal up all of the openings, what's going to happen is you're going to have bats, they're going to die in your attic, and you're going to have dead animals that are going to be stinky and attract pests. And really nobody wants that, and that's not really going to be a good solution. So the next step, now hopefully you've been patient and you waited until the proper time frame, which is after August 15th and before April 15th. And so it's time to potentially start your exclusion. And the other kind of thing you need to consider is that part of the guideline is that when you do the exclusion, you need to have at least 4 nights when the overnight temperature is going to be at least 50 degrees. And I would also add, not pouring rain, because the bats are not going to come out if it's pouring rain. So if you have a good forecast and you're out of the maternity season timeframe, then it's time to go ahead and do your exclusion. So you can install different exclusion methods, different exclusion devices. Two common methods that are used are screening, which is kind of this bottom picture, and also cones, which are the top two pictures. And both of these do the same thing. Basically, those devices are covering up the opening where the person has decided that the bats are coming out. If you have several openings where the bats are coming out, you're going to have to put these structures on every one of them at the same time on the same night. And so we recommend screening over plastic sheeting. Plastic sheeting doesn't tend to work very well. It covers up the air and the bats won't come out. And also hardware cloth tends to be a little bit too rough for the bats and doesn't work as well. So the cones are the same way. They allow the bat to come out, but then later when they come back in the morning after they've been foraging all night, they can't really get in because the cones are kind of tapered. Same thing with the screening, it's kind of tapered. I mean, it's just one little tiny opening at the bottom. So when they come back at night, they want to just swoop up and go into their hole, and they can't do that when that screen is basically, you know, almost flush, just a little bit of space open for the bats to get out. So the next step is, again, now we have to wait. So we have our exclusion devices open on or covered on every single opening that the bats are exiting and entering. And so what's going to happen is, you know, night one, a bunch of bats are going to go out and forage. And again, pending that there's good weather, if it's pouring rain, the bats are not going to come out and go foraging. They'll just hunker down for the night. So night one, they'll come out and go foraging. They'll be out foraging all night. Morning, they'll decide to come back and go to roost, and they won't be able to get back in. So those bats are going to have to go roost probably in a neighboring tree somewhere or somewhere nearby. And the thing is, maybe not all the bats come out every night, which we know is the case. So this is why we need to leave the exclusion device up for 4 nights. So the next night, now we've got some more bats that are still in there. Maybe they didn't come out on night one. And so now this night, we've got a few more bats that are coming out to go foraging. Again, they come back in the morning and they can't get back in. So we leave us up for 4 nights because we know that through doing this time and time again, it seems like 4 nights is sufficient to make sure that all of the bats have come out, and then we can move on to the next step. So the final thing, well, almost the final thing, is to permanently seal the openings. And again, this is one of those places where people tend to take shortcuts. They think, oh, great, we got all the bats out, everything's great. And the bats really like their homes. They really like the place that they've been. They want to be there if they can. So if you don't immediately close up the openings, as soon as you remove those exclusion devices, the next morning, the bats are going to come back. They've probably been waiting for those openings to come up, be there again for them to go in. And so really this is important to, you know, as soon as you remove those exclusion devices, you need to seal up the openings. And kind of, I guess, the very last thing, people often ask about the, you know, cleanup after they've gotten the bats out. Say they were in your attic, if you had a larger colony in there, you probably got some accumulated guano, which is what we call bat poop. And there's often a lot of odor with a large colony, and that typically is from the bats themselves, from the actual kind of oils and things they have on their skin. And so that smell should go away. But the guano itself can also attract pests. It's unsanitary, so you'd probably want to clean that up. It is definitely recommended to wear a mask or a ventilator when you go up into an enclosed space to clean up the guano. To my knowledge, there's not been any cases of histoplasmosis due to bat guano in a building in Florida, but it's always good to be cautious again when we're thinking about disease. So once the bats are displaced, there's really no guarantee where they'll go. And so, this is one thing that people often ask. They have, maybe they put up a bat house and they really say, oh, we want the bats to move into that house, so we'll just exclude them from our attic and surely they'll just move into the house. And we don't know where they're going to go. Bats are going to go wherever they find an ideal roost for them. So, hopefully they find a good place that is not causing another conflict, but we never really know. So one thing I do want to kind of end this basic explanation of exclusions. There's a lot more detail of different materials, different things to look for. And I definitely recommend getting advice and assistance from a professional wildlife excluder. And I would make sure that they have experience doing an exclusion with bats. There's a lot of excluders that tell stories of going back in after another, wildlife or pest control person went in, thought they did an exclusion and they didn't do it right. And so they have to redo the whole thing. So definitely look around and try and find some good professional help if you need to do this. I also wanted to share this video, which is excellent. It was created a few years ago by FWC, IFAS, and the Florida Bat Conservancy. And I will post the link. Unless I have it right here. Actually, I'll post the link in the chat for you. On this page. This page actually has a lot of great information. This is from FWC, and I'm sure there's also some people on this call from FWC that can help you with this issue as well. So this leads us into the final thing that I want to talk about, which is the bat house. And so recently, especially if you're in Gainesville, and if you've ever come to the U of campus, I'm hoping at some point you maybe have seen the bat houses that are across from Lake Alice on campus. And it's known to be one of the world's largest occupied bat houses, mostly Brazilian free-tailed bats, but there's likely a couple other species that are also in there. Estimated could be 400,000 is a kind of a guess, possibly up to even 500,000 bats that have been living in those houses over the last several years. It is active year-round, and so people come all year round and they sit out at sunset and watch the bats emerge. So if you're ever on campus, that's definitely a fun thing to do. And as you can see in this photo, there's actually 3 houses, each of them about 20 feet by 20 feet and, 30, 40 feet off the ground. So what is the story and where the bat houses come from? I'm going to give you a super quick overview of kind of the history. So the bats have been longtime residences on the U of campus, and they are even recognized for helping reduce pests on campus. And about 1987, they were actually living in there was a colony in one of the buildings, a building that burned down. And the bats relocated to a campus stadium. And unfortunately, the stadium wasn't very happy with the bats being there. They were causing problems. There was definitely a conflict with them being in that location. So the folks at UF decided to build a bat house in hopes of getting the colony to relocate from the stadium. So that was in 1991 when this first house was built. Then, as much as they hoped, again, this comes back to we can't really make bats go where we think we want them to go. They tried to get the bats to move in, and the bats decided they weren't necessarily sure if it was the best place for them or not. And it took a couple years to start to get some movement. And that should say 1995. So in 1995, they definitely finally had quite a large colony that decided to live in the house. And so they're really happy about that. It did take a few years. And after some time went by, the house actually got pretty full. The colony grew. And so in 2010, they built the second house, affectionately called the barn, because it's kind of more of a barn shape to accompany the house. And so house number 2 went up in 2010. And similar to the first time, it did take a few years for the bats to move in. And so eventually they decided house number 1 was full enough, I guess, and some bats were brave enough to move into the new house. And now at this point, house number 2 is actually quite full as well. So then in 2017, I think there was some awareness that, the first house was eventually, showing some wear and tear, eventually maybe would need some repairs. So they decided to put up a third house in hopes that that would, someday replace maybe the bats that were living in the first house, if the first house needed to come down at some point. So that went up in 2017. And so then that's kind of where we are now. So in 2017, there are no bats in the house after they built it. And that really brings us to 2020. So as of April of 2020, there were still no bats had moved into that third house. And also in April of 2020 is when I first got a call from some of the Field and Fork, the garden staff that works on the property that surrounds the bat house. Anna Prizia called as she was concerned about the structural decline of house number 1. And so that's what this picture is of. This is the back side of the house that people don't see if they're just on the street side, but it definitely wasn't looking so good. There was a lot of rotten wood, and it was definitely showing signs of, maybe being on its way out. So she convened a meeting of some of the UF Environmental Health and Safety and UF facility staff, also myself and staff from the Florida Museum of Natural History, and a graduate student that had been doing a monitoring project out of the bat house. And we got together, and of course, now if you remember the timeline, this is April of 2022. And if you go back to earlier in my presentation, I said up until April 15th, you can conduct exclusions. After that, you have to wait all summer until August 15th. So of course, this was exactly the timeline that she reached out, which she didn't know that. And so we're like, oh no, this is like the worst time ever. Now we have to wait until August. Of course, my worry was certainly, are we going to get some big storms? Is it going to last until August? So we were kind of worried about what would happen. We definitely started, doing some things to try and help get through the summer. The facilities folks were great at trying to stabilize the house as much as possible. They put up some bracing, and that's the picture on the left. The picture on the right is towards the end of the summer. You can definitely see there was, some of the interior pieces had fallen down. It was really, really starting to fall apart. Amazingly, there were still bats living in there. A lot of them had moved to the second house or elsewhere, but they were still in there because, again, bats really like their home. They have a lot of site fidelity. They want to stay where they're at. It was apparently still providing them with the comfort that they needed. So the other thing that we started doing at that point was trying to, think about, we started kind of monitoring the bats in all of the houses, trying to figure out what was going on. And one of the things to me was like, how can we get the third house, why aren't they using the third house, and how do we get them in there? Because there's a great house sitting there. It would be the ideal place for them to hopefully move into when the first house needs to come down. And so we started trying to figure out what needs to be modified. We had a consultation from Fly By Night come up, some different suggestions floated around, and a lot of the things that they did, we don't know for sure which helped or not, but we did start monitoring the temperature. They put in some more venting in the upper chambers. They installed some of the smaller bat houses on the sides. That was just kind of a suggestion that someone had, that like maybe it would help encourage the bats to move over there. We don't know if it helps or not, but it was just kind of a, it doesn't hurt, so might as well just try it. We put some guano underneath. That's definitely another thing that we don't really know that there's any evidence that that works, but it doesn't hurt to try it. They removed some of the barriers that were underneath, and also tried to get a good look at the baffles, which are the vertical structures which come down, which is where the bats kind of climb up into. Was there proper ridging on that or scouring? And it's probably not the best scouring that it could be, but there's a little bit on there. And the other thing that they did was to install some additional structure around the base of the opening, which acted as kind of landing pads for the bats. And so which of those things, I don't know, maybe a combination of some of them. Maybe it seems like the landing pads had some impact, but shortly after that happened, it seemed that some bats decided to move into the third house. So that was hugely exciting news for us. And the good thing about that is once you get a few bats in there, the other bats start to think, oh, maybe, it's an okay place. And so as the bats started to move, soon after that, it was decided time to do the exclusion. One, because the house was falling down, the first house was about to collapse. And so trying to get the bats out of there safely before the house collapses was certainly a priority. And now that they were actually going in the third house, that was a really good sign that hopefully the other bats would move in there, as opposed to moving somewhere else on campus where maybe we don't want them. So in September, the exclusion, the house number 1, was conducted, and a company came in, and basically they covered up all of the top vents with netting. Well, actually, I should back up. The first thing they did was come out multiple evenings, try and see where the bats were coming out. Which part of the house were they in, which openings were they using? Again, this is going back to the steps that I went over earlier. And so they were able to see, which areas of the structure they were using. And so then they came in, they had a big lift so that they were really safe around this, potentially unstable structure, and able to put up all of this netting. They would come back in the morning to see where the bats were at one point, and they had some videos, but I know better than to try and show a video during a webinar because they never work. So, at one point the bats were kind of coming back around the outside, but it did seem like the bats were then getting discouraged enough to move to another location. And so after several nights of leaving the exclusion up, they were confident that the bats had decided that they didn't need to be in there anymore. And so it seemed as if it was a success. So right after that, and also just prior to the Hurricane Ian coming in, just several days before, they did a kind of a controlled demolition of the house. It was in pretty bad condition as it was, and also, wouldn't want to risk the bats moving back in there either. So with that, I was actually going to talk a little bit about bat houses, but given the time, I'd actually prefer to just stop and take questions. So does anyone have questions? Okay, so you'll have to bear with me. As I look back through If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'm going to read them directly out of the chat. So Barbara asked, when you put the screening up, it must be loose enough so the bats can go in and out for 4 nights. Okay, yeah, so no, and I think someone answered that. So Bree answered that. Thank you, Bree. Hi, Bree. I haven't seen you in a while. So yeah, the netting is loose enough so that they can get out, but not get back in. So that's really the key. And also the bats aren't, again, they're not, just like they kind of need to drop down to get out of a roost and fly, they also need kind of space to get in. So if it's kind of tight and there's not very much space, they're not going to be able to get in there. Fly by night is awesome. Yes, they're great. Let's see. Oh, how do you safely prevent or remove wasps from moving into a bat house? So yes, that's in my bat house slides, but I could show you that really quick, I suppose. Let's see. I think it's 3/4 of an inch spacing. And I will answer the unwanted guess. So make each chamber less than 3/4 of an inch wide is thought to help keep the wasps out. So there is the answer. How high should a small bat house be on a tree? I also have that. You guys are just leading me through my placement. I'll also share a link to a bat house design information, so if you want that. So for your little bat house, well, one is to don't put it on a tree with a bunch of branches because you're going to get predators. But also ideal locations for your bat house, you want to be near water. On the side of a building is okay. Even better is on a pole, and we want it at least 12 feet above the ground, and if you can go higher, that's okay too. What is the range of the bats remain in since I don't understand your question. What is the range of the bats remain in since stable to their home? Joan, I don't understand what you're asking. If you want to reiterate it in another post, I can try and answer it. Any thoughts on replacing house number 1? So I do not have the answer to that. There has been thoughts on it. That's certainly not my call. We were actually supposed to have a follow-up meeting right like 2 days before UF closed for the hurricane, and that meeting got canceled just because of people needing to get prepared for the hurricane. So I'm not sure. And I don't know if there may be someone on here. I saw a few names of people on here that maybe know, but I don't think there's a definitive answer at this point. Sandra asked if any of the bats have white nose syndrome. So not that we know of. So white nose syndrome is typically found in bats that roost in caves. And yeah, like lots of the ones up north are in really large colonies in caves. To our knowledge, we don't have white nose syndrome in our caves here in Florida. And so one thing I'll say, and I had this in my previous presentation on bats as well, just because it's not here doesn't mean it can't. And we hope that it doesn't come here, but if you're a caver and you go outside the state, please clean your gear when you come back and before you go in any cave here. Also, anywhere you go caving, you should be cleaning your gear, ideally even between caves, even if you're kind of in the same area. So, I mean, we know that bats do carry it from location to location, but we also think that, you know, humans are responsible for some of that as well. Liza asked, how can you attract bats to your property? So in general, I would say if you have good habitat that's the best way to attract them. Now that's a pretty big question as far as what kind of bats, what kind of habitat. I mentioned at the beginning some of the roosting structures. And so the most important thing for bats to be sticking around your property would be near water, roosting locations. So if they're tree roosting bats, leaving some snags around, having some palm fronds, like those are types of structures that bats will roost in. You can certainly try putting up a bat house. That doesn't guarantee that bats will move in. It could be years before they do. You never know. Also, having water is important for bats, but they're generally going to go to a pond or something. So if you have a pond feature, that's a benefit. And also having, food for them. Now that's kind of a catch-22 because, you don't want a bunch of pests around at night, but that's what they're going to eat. So I'll say one thing is, fewer pesticides will help keep the bats healthy as well as they're not eating pests with pesticides on them. Patricia asked, oh, thank you, just a comment. Thank you. Is it worth putting up a small bat house? I mean, I don't ever discourage people from putting up small bat houses. You might get some bats in there. The biggest thing is really to be patient. There's no way to guarantee they move in there. If they're happy where they are, they're not looking for a place to move, then they're not going to move in the house. But you never know at what point, some bats living down the street, maybe they're living in a structure that gets torn down and they're looking for a new house. So they might move in your bat house. Susan asks if the rest of the bats who left house number 1 in August during exclusion moved to house 3. We don't know for sure which bats moved where. My assumption is that the bats that moved into the 3rd house were bats that were from the 1st house, because a lot of the interior structures of that 1st house were literally falling to the ground. There were raccoons in there, there were snakes in there. So the 1st house was really probably, the roof was increasingly rotting away. It was probably becoming an increasingly less desirable place for them to be. And so I assume that the bats that moved in house number 3 were most likely from house 2. Facilities, if I think someone from environmental health and safety on here would probably know more if there's been a bunch of bats popping up elsewhere on campus. A recommendation for a nature lover, a 13-year-old nature lover of bats. I don't know, I have to think about that. Maybe if someone has one, they can post in the chat. From Joan, do bats remain within XX miles of their home? Oh, yeah, good question. Okay, I understand you, Joan. So it depends on the species. Some of the faster flying bats can go 30, 40 miles in a night to go forage and then come back to their same roost. Some of the slower moving bats are probably only going to go a few miles. So it depends on the species and how fast they fly and where the closest resources are, where the closest food and water is. Do they have any annual maintenance for wasps in the UF bat houses? I do not think so. So one of the things, there isn't any, the bat houses are just kind of there, and there were cameras inside of them, and those cameras I think at some point stopped working, and so there's not any internal maintenance of like monitoring inside of the houses. Amazingly, it doesn't seem like there's wasps. There were no wasps in the 3rd house when we looked up in there when it was empty, which seems like wasps would have moved in there because it was, a great structure and no one in there. Do bats carry ticks and fleas? No, not that I've never heard of bats carrying ticks and fleas. Kim asked if you have to have bat poop on the house. So No, and that's one of those things I was saying, like, there's no any evidence that that really necessarily works to have a bat guano buy a bat house to get them to move in. Some people think, maybe there is some reasoning behind having like a kind of the scent of the bats on there. I don't know of any research that's actually been done for sure to document that. But again, it's one of those things that maybe doesn't really hurt. We don't know for sure how much it helps. Okay, a few more questions. I'm almost out of time here. So, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and, I have one more thing to share. My last thing I'm gonna share with you. This is, if you do have a bat house, and again, I'm gonna post a link. I'll post a link here, and I can actually email out to anyone that attended with some follow-up links, since I wasn't able to post them during the program. I can post a link to the bat house building designs and any other responses to the questions that I didn't get to. And so if you do have a bat house in your yard, or you're thinking of putting one up, I'll send you this link as well. I'm involved with the Florida Bat Working Group, and we created an app last year trying to get people to share with us information about any bat house that they do have, and asking you to go out and just kind of like do a little mini monitoring of your house and let us know if you have bats in there. So if you do have a house and you've got bats, you can look that up and you can let us know as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up because we're at time. And I will send a follow-up email out. You can email me if you have other questions. And it was a pleasure presenting this to you today. Oh, I almost forgot. I have a poll. Okay, I'm going to launch my poll really quick. If you can just take 30 seconds and respond. It's just 3 short questions.